Yes,
Thank you very much.
and thank you for bringing Hercule Poirot and Murder on the Orient Express to us.
Thank you very much.
Well, certainly Murder on the Orient Express is a very classic mystery novel, and certainly one of Agatha Christie's most beloved ones. But I wanted to know what drew you to this particular novel, and how did you make it your own, not only as director, but also as Hercule Poirot?
Well, I came across the book. My mother started reading crime fiction when I was in my early adolescence, so I would see these books, including this one, around the house. And first of all, the title. I think it's a great title. There are 3 words that get me going: Murder, Orient, and Express. They seem very clever to combine those 3. And I remember reading it and admiring how many characters she used, and I felt that was a smart way of keeping the audience guessing, and she choreographed that very well. I loved the evocation of the golden age of travel. I wanted to get onto that train. I liked the winter setting, so December, and then when it came to me from Fox, Michael Green, who's had an extraordinary year as a screenwriter, as you know, he's written the screenplay for Blade Runner 2049, and he's created American Gods, the TV show from the Neil Gaiman novel, brilliant, I think. So he's in amazing creative form, and he changes the beginning. It's not the same as the novel, it's not the same as the 74 movie, and we, particularly regarding the second part of your question, Hercule Poirot, we have the chance of a sort of an arc for the character that takes us from a man who, at the beginning of the story, says there is right, there is wrong, there is nothing in between, all the way through to a moment where, when we know who and how and why, we then have to consider, well, is there something in between? He's a moral absolutist, and his obsessions, if you like, what he calls his little originalities, they're less the behaviours of a sort of a dandy, and more of a sort of obsessive compulsive individual, so that when those eggs are not the same size, or when that hotel room is an odd number, not an even number, these things almost pain him. Disharmony and imbalance are things that can, produce a collapse. So when he comes up against something that he ought to have a solution to, and he asks the question, where does conscience lie? It makes for a kind of chewy moral issue. So I think Michael dealt with all the things I liked: the glamour, the travel, the darkness, and then in Poirot he gave a different kind of character journey for a different kind of obsessive.
Question ici. Micro. N'hésitez pas à l'ouvrir à ce moment-là.
Hi. Thanks for the movie.
Thank you
It's
very
really brilliant.
Thank you.
It's a 2-part question. The first part is, how did you come up with such a big casting, like all these A-list stars? And second of all, what would you give as an advice to have such a beautiful moustache?
Thank you. Thank you. The first part of the question, the key to the casting was Judi Dench. Judi Dench was the first person I asked, and she was the first person to say yes before I finished the sentence where I asked her. I asked her by, as you know, the handkerchief that Princess Dragomira eventually owns up to having has the N, or the H, which becomes the Russian N. And when I asked Judi to be in it, we got an original lace handkerchief and embroidered her initials in the handkerchief. And she was very taken with that. So we bribed her, basically. She said yes. At least she knew she was going to get a free handkerchief out of it, But once she was on board, she became a kind of magnet. And someone like Johnny Depp worships Judi, absolutely worships it. When they all came together for the first time, literally physically together, they were going to do their first scene, and they were outside the steps of the dining car. and I was on the dining car, and I saw them. They were all very shy with each other, very sort of awestruck, bizarrely enough. And Michelle Pfeiffer was the first person to come up the steps onto the carriage, so I said hello, and I noticed there were tears in her eyes. I thought, Christ, what's happened? I said, are you all right? She said, I just met Judi Dench. I feel so emotional. You know, people also knew, I think, that they would have a chance to explore interesting and different characters, and I think they knew that I love performance. I like actors, so I want them to be good and want to help as best I can, and that they would enjoy being in that group, which they did. They really enjoyed that. As to the moustache, took a few months of realizing the brutal truth. I could not grow that moustache. I have neither the follicle power nor the chemical hormonal combination to produce the sort of double handlebar swirl that my friend Carol Hemming designed. So we spent the following few months sticking things on me and using a bust of me, and we must have had 11 versions of that thing. Agatha Christie referred to them in the novels, as she said in the plural, he wore the most magnificent moustaches in England. She used the plural. Often it was described as magnificent and immense. So the idea was to produce this kind of mask, his superpower, if you like, which he hides behind and he observes people through. And almost his greatest delight is for people to dismiss him. Mary Debenham, Daisy Ridley's character, says in the novel, he was a perfectly ridiculous little man, the sort of man with that moustache that you could not take seriously. And when people do not take Poirot seriously, he has a chance to watch and observe and be a better detective. So the first morning, Daisy actually walked on the set and saw me in the moustache for the first time. She said, Jesus, that's bold. I said, good bold? She said, yeah, good bold. Good bold. So I think we tried to meet Agatha Christie's demand in the book.
And moustaches, plural.
Yes. So we got the two, yeah.
Yeah. Question. Ici.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the film, and thank you for coming and presenting it to us.
Thank you.
I feel like we ought to talk about French accent. Weren't you a bit scared to show the movie to a French audience? And how did you work on it? And
well, in theory, of course, always scared. But in theory, of course, it's his version. He's a Wallonian Belgian who has spoken French but lives in the novels mostly in England. And an interesting thing that he says in the books, aside from the moustache, which he knows has people dismiss him or find him ludicrous, he also says in the novels that he can speak perfectly good idiomatic English, but chooses not to because the world of the broken accent is one that also offers a mask. People also in the glib and patronising way of some folk find that something that they can choose to suggest means that he's somehow not as sharp or as smart as possible. And with I don't speak French, so or even though most of my life I've tried, but I seem to have a sort of block with languages thus far. But it's fun to keep trying. So I did all the way through for probably 6 months until I thought I could maybe possibly order a hotel room that had a shower. That's about as far as I got successfully in French. The goal was really to find an English-speaking Belgian accent that seemed to match the sort of timbre of my voice, and where we could meet that sort of the playfulness with which Poirot speaks. But the process of sort of creating him was quite immersive. I got a chance to read the books, and there are 33 of them. There are 50 short stories, and I was prepping the film while I was in a theatre season, and I knew I was doing about 9 months ahead of time, and I was able to be very ritualistic each day about working on the accent, or working on the moustache, or working on the walk, getting the handmade shoes, getting the fabric for the clothes, beginning to understand his obsessions, and it was a very, very rewarding experience to have that much preparation, which was also completely necessary because I knew that once everybody arrived, I had to be so ready for it that my work on accent and moustache, everything else to do with the sort of technical makeup of Poirot had to be ready to go. Yeah.
Question ici. Oui.
Bonsoir. Hello. Speaking about books, when you read a book, do you see the scenes playing out of your head like a movie? And I've got the second question about the train. It's a confined space. Is it like a theater play for you?
Well, yes. The truth is that I do. I'm mainly drawn to scripts where, when I read them, I can sort of intuitively feel a sense of the sort of visual. So, for instance, a shot that was in my mind, or an approach that was in my mind, when we go to Istanbul station, there's a shot which has Marwan Kenzari, who plays Jean-Michel, or Pierre-Michel. So he comes left to right, and then we see the train, we see Johnny Depp and Josh Gad in the train, we turn around, and there's Penelope Cruz coming here, then we go across and get me and Tom Bateman, we go up, we find Daisy Ridley, and then we get him onto the train, and there's Michelle Pfeiffer, and as we walk down the train, we're still in the same shot, there's Derek Jacobi, and then we meet, anyway, so a lot, all the way through to Poirot getting into his cabin, and I instinctively knew I wanted to do that, and I knew that I wanted to have him leave the train by starting on a Steadicam shot also that took him out and went all the way back through the train that we met when it was champagne and fun and people and music and lightness and romance, and now we walk down the same train after death and snow and frozenness and the understanding of the loss, and you start to listen to that, and then when it comes to the confined nature of the train, I did want to exploit that where it would work for the kind of paranoia and claustrophobia, but I specifically wanted to trap us not in a snowdrift that is in the novel, but in an avalanche, in a more sort of jeopardized and dangerous location, so that we could get out, and McQueen could try to run, and Poirot could try to bring people out of the confined space if he thought that interviewing Mary Debenham outside would get more out of her than interviewing Penelope Cruz in the kitchen. And I wanted at times, and I really enjoyed, there's a great moment in Alfred Hitchcock's film Dial M for Murder, where when Ray Milland is setting up with an accomplice how to kill Grace Kelly, it's Hitchcock suddenly jumps to a top shot where we don't see, when he's in it for 5 or 6 minutes. And I remember seeing that and thinking, in the train, that's how I'd like to discover the body, except I don't want to see the body. So I want to have the audience want to leave. I want the audience to want to nudge the camera up so that they see, is it Johnny Depp? Is he really dead? Is he killed in a particular way? But in going there, I wanted to put, in that confined space, our audience here in the same position as the people on the train who know something's happened. They're acting, but exactly what Poirot has seen. So the confines of the train made me feel very sort of inventive about how to be in it, out of it, on top of it, underneath it, and in a way make it sort of, in a way untheatrical but cinematic.
And you managed.
Thank you.
Ici.
Ici, je crois. Bonsoir, désolé, je vais la faire en français.
Bien sûr.
Donc, c'est une histoire qui a déjà été racontée au cinéma, donc c'est adapté d'un livre. Comment est-ce que, en tant que metteur en scène, vous avez travaillé pour, malgré le fait que ce soit une histoire que beaucoup de gens connaissent déjà, pour qu'il y ait quand même du suspense, on ait quand même une tension, notamment à la fin, en fait, la dernière partie de la révélation. Il y a des gens qui ont déjà vu le précédent film, qui ont lu le livre, qui vont voir votre film, donc il va y avoir forcément une comparaison. Et du coup, comment est-ce qu'on travaille pour s'assurer qu'on captive jusqu'au bout un maximum de gens, y compris des gens qui connaissent déjà l'histoire?
Well, obviously this is a well-known and beloved novel. It was transposed to the screen already. So, as a director, how do you manage to always try to keep the suspense going, the tension going, and of course also to avoid comparisons? Basically, how do you keep us guessing, even when we know what might happen?
Well, it's a good question. It's one we had to answer early on, and I'm familiar with it because having come from the classical theatre. I mean, for instance, last year I directed a production of Romeo and Juliet, and most people know what happens at the end. Romeo and Juliet don't make it. Sorry, that's a spoiler alert. Forgive me if I've ruined your experience of Shakespeare, but in this case, we did make some changes. So the book begins in Syria, in Aleppo. The 74 movie begins with a flashback of the Armstrong murder, and we begin in Jerusalem at the Wailing Wall with the idea of presenting Poirot in action with a denouement to another case. And I remember reading and thinking that when the policeman runs and gets himself caught on that cane, that was a very pleasing example of Poirot being a little ahead of us, and that already that might make the audience start to feel, oh, so that's not what we're used to. Plus, he himself is a little more active, and we're in a different place. And so to do that early, I think, was important. We changed some characters around. So in the 74 film, there's a character, and in the book, there's a character called Greta Olsen, who was played by Ingrid Bergman. Here, there's a character called Pilar Estravados, who is Penelope Cruz. And an Italian in the book, Antonio Foscarelli, becomes Beniamina Marquez with Manuel Garcia Ruffalo. And